Recording in progress.
Whatever that sound is, it sounds like something out of like Jurassic Park. Good morning, and good morning to folks here. Sorry, I just got distracted by a goose fight over there. The geese are taking over. Yeah, it's special. So today we're going to keep going with this lecture. If we get all the way through it, I have an activity. If not, we'll do that on Wednesday. Just thinking about what's coming up because there's not so much time left, which is sort of mind-blowing. So Friday, we'll start talking about everyday living. We'll have class Wednesday, Friday, Monday, and then no class the following Wednesday or Friday because it's Thanksgiving. So eat your turkey or ham or turkey, whatever you enjoy. When we come back, we'll do a finish on everyday living, do some reflections on thinking like a scientist. Remember your posters are due so that I can give you feedback on them on the 3rd of December. And then the actual presentations, exam 4 will be the 6th, but actual presentations are during our scheduled exam time. And they're going to be at 9 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. for a couple of reasons. One, I dropped my daughter off around 8. 2 is it's not that big the whole time, so why should we not just like fall asleep in a little bit? So we're going to roll with that. So yeah, for those who got here a little early, I was saying I did grade exam 3, but I have one person who still needs to take a makeup, so I'm going to hold off on passing that back. But your grades are in Blackboard for that. In general, people seem to do pretty well. And again, I take the feedback y'all gave me on Friday, and I will be very mindful when I'm craft exam 4 to make the short answers actually short answers. So thank you all for putting up with the extra long exam 3. Alrighty, I think that's about all I have to catch you up on. So let's go ahead and dive into this. Alrighty, so we've been talking about the various cognitive biases, and it's sort of a why do people do what they do. Basically, we're talking a lot about social psyche stuff. And I'm just realizing. I'm not sure. No, it is. Okay, good. I thought for a minute my video wasn't going because this is not getting any kind of light on it, but I'm there. All right. So yeah, this is thinking about how to think about other people critically, if that makes sense, and also ourselves more than anything else, obviously starting with this slide, right? So one of the things that distinguishes us and distinguishes this class, honestly, from another class in scientific literacy or from just thinking about scientific literacy in general is the fact that psychologists study people, right? And we've talked already about how complex that makes it and how much of a challenge that makes it, right? And so in Western cultures like the United States, Western Europe, Australia, we tend to see the self-serving bias. So this is a tendency to attribute our successes to personal characteristics, and our failures we kind of put off on other people. It refers to the perception of yourself as above average on a variety of traits and characteristics. So kind of always making ourselves look good. So again, this is most evident in those individualistic cultures. In Eastern cultures, in those collectivist cultures, you're much more likely to see what's called self-effacement. And that is modesty in personal attributions for success. Instead, you would attribute the accomplishments to others or to your relationships with others. So the entire team did this, or this is attributed to my family, not just me, for example. Alrighty, so this is from your book, so you may have already done it, but just take a minute to look this over. So it's a list of 6 attributes. And you can just sort of scribble on your paper or do it in your mind where you would rank yourself on each of these. Okay, so if you're not perfectly all the way done, that's okay. What I want you to do is go through and count how many you ranked yourself above average or far above average. So just sort of get a number out of 6. All right, and Zoom folks, I'm going to pop out the chat so you can comment too. Hopefully you were also doing this. So did anybody rank themselves above average or far above average on all of them? Okay, humble people, I appreciate that. How about more than half? You guys are so good that you are like disproving these things every time. I appreciate that. So typically what happens is that people will rank themselves as like above average, more than average, if that makes sense. Like people will just be like, I'm above average on everything. And then that essentially means that everyone is above average, right? Which isn't like statistically possible. So again, y'all are pretty psychologically minded. You've learned quite a bit in this class. Maybe you're also super humble. So that's great that you're kind of figuring that out already. But typically people tend to think of themselves as above average. And again, if everyone's above average, then the average just moves, right? So it's something interesting to think about. I very much appreciate that either psychology is already filled with pretty astute people or this class is like doing its job. Maybe a combination of the two. So again, like this says, if you're like most people, you probably evaluated yourself above average. Professors do the same. More than 90% of professors rated themselves as above average, and 2/3 thought they were in the top quarter. Again, just like not statistically possible, right? And one thing I'll say is like a caveat to this is if you are experiencing any kind of psychopathology, particularly something like depression or anxiety, this is going to change, right? You're in fact might be more skewed towards the below average because you'll have a negative view of yourself. So that's just an important note to think about in terms of this is not really as universal as they imply. All right, so I have a little video on the self-serving bias as well here.
The self-serving bias describes the tendency of people to attribute success to themselves and failure to outside factors. In other words, if it worked, it's because of me. If it didn't, it's because of someone or something else. It's a common type of cognitive bias that has been studied extensively in social psychology. For example, if a person passes her driving test on the first try, she says that it was because she studied hard and she is a good driver. But if she fails, she blames the examiner, the car, the weather, or anything but her bad driving skills. Studies show that the self-serving bias happens in many different situations of our daily lives, at school, at the workplace, in relationships, sports, and even when we decide what to shop. Researchers think that it helps protect our self-esteem and reduces hurtful emotions we can't control. Self-control, culture, and emotion all play a role, and we even use it to protect others when we say, "It wasn't your fault, there's nothing you could have done." It sounds innocent, but the self-serving bias can have a great impact on our life because we don't learn from our mistakes, and that we can do something for years without getting better at it. If the driving student admits that she failed because she didn't practice enough, she could ask people for help, study harder, and pass the test on a second try. After all, you can only influence your own actions and not those of others or your environment. So here are some tips that can help you avoid the pitfalls of self-serving bias. Get started by observing yourself and notice when you're doing it. Then ask yourself, why are you doing it, and does it help you move forward? Try to imagine how your future looks if you use the self-serving bias a lot, and what happens if you accept your failures or look at things that help you succeed. Try not to think about the causes of problems too much without moving forward and trying to solve them. When we dwell on the past, our mind looks for excuses, which starts the self-serving bias. Recognize when something is your own fault and learn to forgive yourself. Everybody makes mistakes, but only the people who understand when they did something wrong can learn and grow. This social innovation video was sponsored and created.
Alrighty, so we have a comment in the chat here. Just turn it to motivational speech quick. Yeah, that's the other problem with some of these YouTube videos, right?
Created by minute.
On that vein than informational sometimes, but I think that this is really interesting. I mean, I would say that there's maybe a couple inaccuracies, like the idea that you can't influence other people or your environment is not true. We know that's reciprocal, right? That we can influence our environment and that our environment obviously can influence us back. And we certainly know that, we can influence each other as well. That being said, what you really have the most control over is your own actions, right? So that's something to think about. All right, so this is a giant block of tests. I'll try to distill it down for y'all. What is the antidote to the self-serving bias? The first thing is just being aware of it, right? But research shows that that's not enough, right? That it's sort of necessary but not sufficient to get rid of this bias. Just having the knowledge about it doesn't necessarily make you suddenly immune to it. And I apologize if you guys are getting a little bit of sigh. I sweat when I teach, so I do need some air here. They give this Noelle, Forsyth, and Kelly study where essentially they had students do interviews with, they call them actors, we typically call them confederates. Someone who is, part of the study, but isn't necessarily sharing that they're part of the study. And they blame things on bad teachers, difficult work, parents, roommates, and other uncontrollable factors. But then they'll say, like, they learned from it. And it was significant when they got significantly higher grades because of it. So the students who viewed those video recordings essentially got higher grades themselves later because they sort of modeled the behavior, if that makes sense. So sometimes hearing that it worked for someone else is what will make us more likely to try to change things up. And I do have to say, like, this happens sometimes. Sometimes literally people have stuff that's just out of their control, right? Fully acknowledge that. But I remember, so I sat on the Committee on Academic Standing for 2 years, which is a committee that reviews folks who like might get suspended for a semester because of their low GPAs. And there was one student who was in like her second semester of her sophomore year, who I had been like her initial advisor. And she said that like, because I told her to take their own classes, which I didn't her first year, like that had screwed her over for the entire time. And I was like, well, apparently I just messed up this woman's life. And luckily, you know, my colleagues kind of knew, you know, she's not taking personal responsibility. You know, sure, could I have helped more? Probably, right? But you also have to seek out my help. And so there's a give and take for sure. So if you're in pairs with people and you're paired up with somebody you don't know very well, or you don't know each other at all, then that self-serving bias is really there. You want to take personal credit for any successes, and you blame the distant partner for failures. But when you have, say, a friendship or a romantic relationship or a family relationship with that person, you take less credit for your successes and more blame for the failure. So essentially, you see a little bit of that self-effacing bias come into play, you know, that element of the collectivistic culture when it's someone you know and care about. So by asking the right questions, doing what y'all are doing, taking this class, we can reduce it by essentially learning what we can and cannot control, and essentially finding people to model our behavior off, right? People who are doing well, who are doing things that work, and sort of going with that rather than just sort of being like, well, it was everybody else's fault, so I'm not going to try anymore. All right, one of the things you've probably heard the most out of all of these is cognitive dissonance. This really has gotten into our popular culture as a term that people throw around, and sometimes they use it accurately, and sometimes they don't. So I think it's important to talk about what this actually means in psychology. So cognitive dissonance is the feeling of anxiety that you get when there's inconsistency between your personal beliefs and your behaviors or attitudes, right? So let's say you're someone who strongly believes, you know, the world is a just place and good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people, and something horrible happens to you, and you think you're a good person, right? That sense of anxiety, a certain uncertainness, that's cognitive dissonance, where it's like the world isn't lining up the way I feel like it should, and I don't know how to interpret that. All right, so this is a little video related to that.
In the 1950s, a cult in the US believed the world would be destroyed by a flood on December 21st, 1954. Many of its members were so convinced that they left their jobs and gave away all their possessions. And then came December 22nd. As you can imagine, the group felt, a gnawing sense of discomfort, but they also contributed a lot to the field of psychology. See, 3 social psychologists had infiltrated this group, and one of them, named Leon Festinger, gave a name to the group's inner conflict. He called it cognitive dissonance, and it's now a huge area of research. You have probably even experienced it before. But cognitive dissonance isn't always a bad thing. In fact, it can be a major way we grow. At least, if you know how to spot it. Cognitive dissonance is a state of uneasiness that happens when you have inconsistent beliefs or behaviors. You may have felt it when you learned new information about the world that contradicted something you'd believed for a long time, or maybe you learned something about your behavior that conflicted with your sense of self. For example, someone might experience cognitive dissonance if they believe they're not a prejudiced person, but after a psychological test, they realize they have a lot of implicit biases. This discomfort can come up in all kinds of scenarios, though, and we can even see it in the brain, notably in the region that monitors errors in your thoughts and actions, the one involved in rationalizing and cognitive control, and one likely involved in emotions, especially anger and disgust. Of course, knowing how our brains respond to this stress doesn't make these feelings any easier, and it also doesn't make it easier to admit we're wrong. Instead, how hard it is to change your mind about something depends on what psychologists call your resistance to change. And that trait depends on a few factors, such as how much you identify with your belief, how much satisfaction you get from your behavior, and how much pain or loss you'd have to endure to change those things. For example, let's say you see yourself as an advocate for the environment, but then you learn that the company you work for makes like evil villain levels of pollution and refuses to change. If you don't like the job and you have another opportunity, you'd probably just leave. Your resistance to changing your behavior would be pretty low. But if you've been working there for years and are really invested in the company and the community and culture there, quitting would be harder because you'd experience more loss. So your resistance to change would be much higher. One way around this would be to change your belief, to decide that maybe you're not that much of an environmental advocate after all. But if that's not an option, your brain might try other strategies to reduce your uneasiness. For instance, you might try to rationalize your thinking or behavior by finding positive things about your company, or you might think of things that are even worse and make your company seem lovely by comparison. Like you might remind yourself that your company creates jobs and a better quality of life for some people. Or you might read stories about other companies that dump toxic waste directly into people's mouths and think, well, your company at least isn't doing that, so they're fairly green by comparison. Then you can keep thinking of yourself as an advocate with a clean conscience. This is just an example, of course. Cognitive dissonance can apply to all kinds of ways we interact with the world, and there are also plenty of other ways we tend to react to it. Like we might try and protect ourselves from discomfort by engaging in selective exposure. That's where someone only listens to people and media sources that agree with them, and they dismiss other voices that challenge their worldview. Studies suggest that we might also do this internally. We skew our memories to reduce the feeling that our thoughts are inconsistent. For example, in a 2014 paper, 121 students who didn't want their tuition to increase were asked to write an essay supporting higher tuition. Afterward, they became more in favor of tuition increases, but they also misremembered themselves as being okay with higher tuition in the first place. And finally, there's the most simple thing. When faced with evidence that we might be wrong, our brains can just completely ignore whatever's making us uncomfortable. The point is, we really don't like feeling inconsistent, and consciously or not, we'll go a long way to reduce the feeling that our thoughts or actions don't line up with the way we see ourselves or the world. Still, cognitive dissonance isn't always bad. There are fewer studies about this, but it seems like this discomfort can also help us grow and make better decisions, like by leaving an unhealthy job or identifying biased beliefs. So, what can you do about your brain's clever schemes to reduce it? Well, psychologists recommend you pay attention to your initial response to new information and remind yourself you're probably more biased than you want to think. Then you can make a deliberate effort to question your response and analyze it. And also, it doesn't hurt to do some research to make sure your beliefs and actions are based on evidence and not on the tricky games your brain is playing to ease your inner conflict. Because in some cases, the first step to defeating your own brain is knowing what it's up to. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Psych. This channel.
All right, so that gives you some ideas about, sort of these things going on. One of the things I thought of as he was talking is to just talk very briefly about Festinger. You know what? Here we go. Famouspsychologists.org. I was trying not to go to Wikipedia, so we do have an option here. So Festinger was probably one of the most influential social psychologists that most people have never heard of. Obviously, if you take social psych, you're going to learn about him So he had a social theory of the proximity effect. He is the one who developed social comparison theory, which is what a lot of my research is based on. As you see, he did research on cognitive dissonance, things along those lines. I'm not voicemail because I don't recognize the number. And so he is someone that, again, like a lot of people, if you're not in social psych, don't recognize, right? But huge influence. And some of what John Green, or not Green, sorry, Hank Green was talking about there, goes back to that, like the idea, like if your company is doing something bad, the fact that you would engage in what are called downward comparisons with other companies, where essentially you would say, well, but yeah, but there's people that are, doing this even worse than I am, right? As a way to sort of manage that dissonance. This is why people will stay in really problematic situations, right? So he gave the idea of a cult. In cults, not only have you often invested your time, but also your financial resources. And this is also, I believe, why a lot of people will get sucked into things like multi-level marketing, MLMs, which are essentially just pyramid schemes. So, this started with things like Avon and Tupperware, and now it's everything, right? It's like, it works at Crazy Rack thing, and supplements, and makeup, and LuLaRoe, and all of that. And essentially, it's like, you keep thinking you're gonna make $1 million, doing it, and in fact, just by the way they're constructed, you really can't ever make a lot of money unless you are near the top of the pyramid. So yeah, cognitive dissonance really explains that. It also explains why people maintain political views that don't make sense, right? Just the idea, I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. I saw a sign the other day, so someone in an anti-vax protest that says something like, vaccines kill germs or something, and it's like, that's a cell phone, right? And yet people are just so convinced by things, they hold them so dearly. Or even to flip it and think about the more liberal side, right? We just had this big climate conference, and our president was one of the people advocating most strongly for things. And apparently within the next couple of weeks, he's also auctioning off oil rights to lands, right? And so that creates dissonance, because you're like, wait, how can this what? And again, a lot of people who would be very pro-Biden, maybe not wanting to think critically, might just sort of ignore that, right? All right, here's another video I like to listen because it has more distinct examples.
We all know that smoking is bad for us. This is a message that is drilled in our minds from the moment we enter elementary school. Cigarettes are bad. They'll kill you. They'll give you lung cancer. You know all these messages just as well as I do. So why is it that over 30 million American adults still smoke? Why is vaping, a trend that still involves ingesting nicotine, still a trend in the first place? Why have we not completely eliminated smoking? Part of the answer is that nicotine is so addictive that it takes hold of people who smoke. Quitting isn't easy, although it can be done. But we would be remiss to neglect the psychological processes that happen whenever someone picks up a cigarette, especially when they know that it's bad for them. Sure, some smokers pick up cigarettes or Juuls with the intention of hurting themselves, but most people do not. They face a crossroads known as cognitive dissonance. The discomfort of being at this crossroads often pushes the smoker to keep smoking. So cognitive dissonance does not just occur when you're lighting up a cigarette. We experience cognitive dissonance as we read the news, whenever we drive a car, or force ourselves to go to sleep at night. And in this video, I'm going to talk about what cognitive dissonance is and how it influences the mind. The more you understand this process, the easier it will be to make well-informed decisions down the road. And that might mean putting down the cigarette. So first of all, what is cognitive dissonance? In 1957, Leon Festinger published A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, and it defined the term as a state of mental discomfort that arises from holding two different beliefs or values. This discomfort may also come about if we're pressured to act in a way that goes against our belief system. The mind likes simple things. It also likes consistencies. And if you hold two opposing beliefs, such as, I want to stay alive for a long time, and I want to smoke a cigarette, the mind is not going to feel so comfortable. So what does the mind do? It attempts to minimize the discomfort in any way that it can. So here lies the most important point that Festinger made in his book. Minimizing discomfort in the mind can be a great motivator. At the time, this idea was quite new, but it's proved to be an interesting explanation for many of the decisions that we make every day. Now, I want to go into a little bit of some examples of cognitive dissonance. The first one is cigarette smoking, obviously. Festinger used the example of cigarette smoking to show just how powerful cognitive dissonance is. Again, we all know that smoking is bad for us, yet people who are addicted to nicotine still want to smoke or use their Juul. Festinger suggested that when smokers encounter cognitive dissonance, they will reason with themselves to minimize this discomfort. They will tell themselves that maybe smoking isn't actually that bad, or they'll say that they're not smoking enough to cause any real damage. They may also tell themselves that smoking is better than other bad habits, or that quitting will lead to other bad habits, like overeating or alcohol abuse. These are all just explanations that they justify smoking with. And to a non-smoker, these justifications don't exactly add up. They certainly do not negate the fact that smoking is bad for you. But these are things that someone will tell themselves to get rid of cognitive dissonance. Another example is fake news. Now, we currently live in a very polarized political climate. People feel that they have to be on one side. The other side is full of lying and cheating buffoons. Cognitive dissonance plays a part in this polarization. Cries of fake news is a common way to deal with cognitive dissonance. Failing to research the current pandemic, yet calling it a conspiracy, is one way to minimize the discomfort of knowing that going out and partying could cost you your life, or others theirs. Sure, there are a lot of false stories circulating on this information, but simply writing it off as fake news, just because it goes against your current views and what you want to do, is a result of minimizing cognitive dissonance. Another example is peer pressure. Now, this concept may also explain why people stay in relationships, stay in organizations, or jobs that are not in their best interest. Peer pressure can create a strong sense of cognitive dissonance. It's easier to go with the crowd sometimes, especially if that crowd is a cult. Studies have shown that this is true. In one study, a group of people were told to answer a question about whether two lines were the same length or if they were different. Everyone in the group, including actors in the study, gave a blatantly wrong answer. 75% of the time, the participant they were observing did the same, to seemingly just go along with the group. Now moving on, cognitive dissonance is powerful, which is exactly why you need to know about it. With this information, you can be more aware about how you are making decisions and whether or not you're letting this discomfort get the best of you. Now, discomfort is inevitable if you're learning new information, hearing the opinions of others, or making difficult decisions. It's just going to happen. But now that you're aware of what cognitive dissonance is, you can be on the lookout for it. Now, this may require practicing mindfulness to build up some kind of awareness of your thoughts and feelings. The more in tune that you are with your body and your mind and your thoughts, the easier it will be to spot discomfort. If you know the source of this discomfort, you'll be less likely to be swayed by it. I suggest allowing yourself to feel uncomfortable when someone challenges your viewpoints. Take the time to actually research claims that you see online, rather than just brushing them off as fake news. Step back from decisions that you might make due to peer pressure. Cognitive dissonance aims to keep things simple, but it can put you in a real mess of a situation if you end up making the wrong decision. I want to thank you for watching this video on cognitive dissonance, and I really
So again, some nice examples there that is illuminated a little bit more, right? That it can really play into things like fake news, which are what your supplemental articles for this set of readings were about. And, you know, just again, political beliefs and not changing from them even when you get new information, right?
we all know
All right. So as we were just mentioning, this is really related to hypocrisy, which is giving the appearance of believing something we really don't, or maybe thinking we believe it, but then acting in a different way. So the most clear example I can think of this is the conservative politicians who are very pro-life, but then if they knock up their mistress, right, they pay her off to get an abortion. You know, and again, that's not everybody, but it certainly happens more than we would think for someone who's, again, very adamantly pro-life. So this is, you know, it highlights discrepancies between attitudes slash beliefs and behavior. So the most important anecdote here is to do exactly what that video just said. Careful consideration of the information that you get, looking at things up, snopesing it, things along those lines, and making corrections can be really hard, but can also be really valuable. So we watched that video earlier in the semester of Bill Nye talking about why he changed his opinion on GMOs, right? And a lot of people were like, oh, you betrayed us, blah, 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 blah. And he was like, no, I just made a more informed opinion after I researched it. All right, so that's a big piece of this as well. And trying to be aware of our own dissonance, which, as they fully acknowledge in these videos, is really hard, right? But trying to be aware of that and using that as a guide to improving your behaviors. All right, so justification is another thing that your book talks about. So self-justification is excusing or justifying behavior that we or others might see as inconsistent. So essentially, getting out of cognitive dissonance by saying, oh, but it's okay in this scenario because of X, Y, Z, essentially. You often ignore or deny negative or conflicting feedback. And one thing your book doesn't talk about that is really related to this is system justification theory, which is the idea that we have a tendency to act to maintain the status quo in society, even if it's detrimental to us personally. So this is why women, people of color, LGBTQ plus people might vote for candidates who seem to express beliefs that will explicitly oppress them, right? And you're like, why are they voting for them? Do they hate themselves? No, it's just, this is a tendency within society. We tend to think, in general, the status quo is working, right? And this might not even be conscious. So we will, again, act to maintain that status quo, even if it is, being detrimental to us personally. So this next one is about self-justification.
Hey, you're both just slightly different shades of the same color. Yes.
It's really quiet, so let me pump it up here.
What is this? I have no idea what I'm looking at. Oh gosh, this is a nightmare. I'm going to fail. But what if? No, it's wrong. I'm a good student. I could never. But then again, if I fail this, my family is going to be so disappointed in me. Besides, I attended every single class this semester. I don't deserve to fail. I've worked so hard on this. I have to keep up with my reputation. Just a peek, it won't hurt. No, why am I justifying this? Then again, it's an unreasonably difficult test. This is just a midterm exam. It isn't as important as my finals. Everyone's cheating anyways. It's not a big deal. I didn't invent cheating. It's just going to help boost my grades a little, get me into a good school, which means better job opportunities in the future, which means that I will be able to provide a comfortable life for myself and my family, and be a respected member of society. So in the bigger picture, what I'm really doing is making everyone's lives better. That seems reasonable.
Thank you. I'm a genius. I totally deserve this. My blue is great. My blue is greater. Nonsense. How could you say that? My blue is clearly better. No, it's not. My blue is clearly the best.
Why won't they understand?
Hey, you guys are just a slightly different shade of the same color. That makes neither of you any better or worse than the other. Yes.
A nice example there.
Goodbye, Mr. Caffeine. And hello, Mr. Decaf. This is a bit creepy.
So I like that one because, again, it's kind of quirky and cute, but she really showed with, especially that first scenario, how that justification works, right? Like how you can really talk yourself into doing something that is maybe not at all within your bounds and morals, and in fact can twist it such that you decide that in fact this is a good thing to be doing, right? And so things along that line can certainly happen. All right, the next video is social psychologist John Jost, who is the creator of system justification theory, if I can get words out. And so he's going to briefly talk about that.
My name is John Jost, and I'm a professor of psychology and politics at New York University. And for over 20 years, I've been working on a framework which we call system justification theory, which arose out of a set of questions that I began to ask myself years ago as I attended talks and took courses not only in psychology, but in sociology and political science and philosophy, and so on. And a set of questions sort of began to occur to me. Things like, why is it that some women feel that they're entitled to less pay than men? Why do people stay in abusive relationships? Why do some African American children feel that white dolls are more attractive or better than black dolls? Why do victims of injustice blame themselves sometimes, and why do other people blame victims of injustice? Why is it so difficult to get people to stand up for themselves and for others? And why is personal and social change such a painful, difficult thing? Why do we tolerate political and economic corruption and vast inequalities between the rich and poor? Is there a common denominator to all of these questions, really, is what I wanted to know, and it's still what I want to know. And the idea that began to occur to me is that it may be that people are motivated in various ways to justify and rationalize the social, economic, and political systems on which they depend. And these social systems, I think, can range in terms of size and scope, from dyadic relationships and families to groups and organizations at work, to even entire societies or institutions within societies. And the basic idea, it's similar to other ideas in social psychology, which is things like people are motivated to justify themselves and to maintain a positive image of themselves. People are also motivated to justify the actions of their own groups and to hold attitudes that are relatively favorable towards members of their own group, whether it's a school or a sports team or a company that they work for. We like to have positive attitudes about the groups we belong to and about ourselves. And it may be that something similar goes on at the level of social, economic, and political institutions. We also want to hold positive attitudes and to feel that the institutions on which we depend are themselves legitimate and desirable. And we can be quite defensive about this and claim that our way of doing things is superior to other people's ways of doing things, which almost surely inhibits learning from other social systems and about things that work elsewhere. And so this is sort of the key idea of system justification theory. We've been, my students and I have been doing a lot of empirical research on this topic, but one of the key questions is why? Why would people be motivated to justify the status quo? And the view we've come to is that believing in the legitimacy of the social system serves underlying epistemic, existential, and relational needs or motives to reduce uncertainty, to establish a sense of safety or security, and to foster a sense of social belongingness or perhaps conformity. So in other words, believing that the systems and institutions that are familiar to us and on which we depend are legitimate and desirable makes us feel better. It makes us feel more certain about things. It makes us feel more safe and secure, and it makes us feel more like more of an attachment to other people in society. And maybe it's easier even to think about this in this idea in its negative form. In order to really engage in sustained, profound forms of protest, people need to be willing and able to tolerate a great deal of uncertainty, a great deal of possible insecurity and threats to their own safety. They may get arrested, they may get beaten up, and so on. They don't know what's going to happen, whether their efforts will be successful or not. And they may face costs in terms of relational connections to other people. Their family members may not even understand what they're doing. They're cut off, perhaps, from mainstream society. And this is one of the reasons, I think, that burnout rates are extremely high among social and political activists. It's a very challenging thing psychologically as well as socially and politically to really try to change the status quo.
Yeah, what he just said is so true. So nonprofit organizations, particularly those that work for sweeping social change, have giant rates of turnover because of exactly what he just said, because of the fact that people burn out so quickly, right? Because it's something that, especially if it's a cause you're passionate about, right? You're going to put all of yourself into, and like, it's then hard to separate your job from your life. And I mean, it's similar to what we've all experienced in the past year and a half, right? Where it's hard to separate work from your life if those two things are happening in the same place, right? So that's really important. All right, we'll stop there for today, and so we'll do the activity on Wednesday. And yeah, I'll stick around for a couple minutes if anyone has questions, and we'll go from there. Yeah, it's gonna be a group activity y'all do together. Actual paper. Yeah, actual paper. It's like a novel concept to this day and age, but yes. You too. want to supplement with websites, that's okay, but have at least 4 solid resources, if that makes sense. Yep, exactly. Yep. Yeah, so it's just like what helps you to come to discussions.